Right, let's begin. I'll just project the entire screen right now. Right, I hope I am audible enough. So, good evening, sir. I am Aditya. I have already submitted you the discussed research paper in question here, and I will be talking about the bullwhip effect and its applications in the Indian context, as I have discussed in the report in great detail. Right, I hope you are able to see my screen right now. Fine. Let me just go into slideshow mode. Perfect. Fantastic. So before I jump into the presentation basics and the bifurcation of what I've discussed in the report to a large extent, I would actually like to talk about something personal to start off with. So the bullwhip effect is something that obviously I've discussed in class, but the context here is a very, very realistic challenge that most of the supply chain professionals, I mean, I guess everywhere in the world, regardless of which market or which sector they're based out of, this is one of their key challenges that they have to face on a very, very regular basis as well. And the reason why I have taken this topic in the first place is there's two personal reasons actually. One is, as you can see, I'm also a certified Lean Six Sigma Green Belt holder right now. As an aspirant or somebody who wants to pursue a very rigorous career in supply chain, the bullwhip effect is something that I came across on the very onset of the curriculum of my Six Sigma course as well. And it turns out that solving this is one of the hallmark standards which establishes how effective or how likely to succeed a supply chain manager is in the field. It's one of those success metrics, if I may even go to the extent of saying so. And the other personal reason is back in my practice school one, I had the lucky opportunity to work on a green belt level project, which was eventually collated into a black belt level project at Vedanta Resources Private Limited. And the bottom line of that project was that the bullwhip effect needs to be tackled in a much more seasonal, in a much more forecasting basis. What that means is they need to be much more rigorous in terms of the data they're using, they're utilizing for the modeling of the projections, as well as uh, the tolerance level of the projections that they are coming up with. That has to be much more strict and streamlined in order to be more effective in terms of return on investment. And I will be explaining how that is going to play into the picture here as well. But this was the basis on which I actually chose this particular topic to begin with, when I was given the opportunity to work on this particular presentation using the concepts that you have very well taught us in class. uh, I've given my ID number here for reference as well. I hope that would suffice the introduction from my end. Now, moving on, we need to understand that it is obvious that we're incorporating technology in everything that we're doing, which remotely involves engineering or problem solving. And supply chain is not stranger to the utilization of technology historically as well. As we have also time and again come across many case studies that we have done very rigorously in class. Supply chain, on the contrary, is one of the forefront areas where a lot of experimentation of technology takes place. But the question here that we're facing is not something that can be solved by technology alone. It is a psychological problem fundamentally, bullwhip effect. And to solve a very, very critically psychological problem, we also need to leverage some street smartness on our own end, apart from rigorous quantitative data analysis, as I will be going into detail in detail end of my presentation as well. So, as we have already again, time and again seen in these case studies, there is a trend that has emerged. The trend is that every supply chain is very, very context driven. The context is dependent on the product, or the segment of the consumers it is targeting, or the raw materials of the product which eventually lead to the realization of the product in the market. So it is impossible to come up with one universal solution to every supply chain problem in the world, because of the very context driven nature of the supply chains which are operating even in a transitive basis. What I mean by transitive basis is, let us say I am using this laptop for presenting you in a situation where I'm not able to physically attend classes. Now, to make this laptop, we have had so many components, let's say a random access memory chip, a processor chip, or even the screen, which is using some technology, the plastic, which is comprising of the body. So, for the realization of this laptop to reach my hand as a consumer in the market, so many subproducts or so many raw materials which went into realization of the laptop itself for products for some other supply chain which are backing it. So in essence, what products we are using in our regular lives are not the products of one universal supply chain, rather they are a transitive accumulation of multiple supply chains stacked up in a very horizontal way. So naturally, if there are certain trends that can be traced back to the microprocessor which are being produced, which are effectively again used as a raw material for the manufacturing of such laptops which I'm using right now, naturally any trends, any projections which are creating any disruption there is directly going to have an impact on this laptop itself. So the bullwhip effect of something that can be found in the microprocessor industry is not only going to be limited to the microprocessor industry itself. It is going to have a very, very transitive, and in some cases, depending on the nature of the industry itself, an exponential impact on the end products of multiple other supply chains which are transitively linked to it. So naturally, when we are talking about experimentation of technology, which was my starting point to begin with, it is very, very important to understand that experimentation has to be done very, very carefully so that it does not create a negative return on investment to begin with. It is quite possible, given the nature of the supply chains that we're using, that if you're investing an X amount of money for a experimentative based technology, let's say even artificial intelligence, machine learning, reinforcement learning, you name it, we need to define it very, very accurately depending on the context so that it does not incur losses in terms of the impact that it is generating when it is established as a technology in our supply chain. So just because an opportunity cost exists or an untapped potential exists, it does not necessarily mean that leveraging technology to tap into it will always yield positive results. That is going to be a very, very key area of study for this presentation, as has been the case in the research paper which I've submitted as well. So, of course, without saying, a personalized customization of the supply chain is very, very important. By personalization, I mean depending on the nature of the sector and the product itself and the consumers, obviously. So, we're going to be looking at it in three verticals. The very first vertical, as you can see, is going to be where do we draw the line between the cost effectiveness of the technology that we're using and the effectiveness of the technology itself. Of course, you cannot keep on splurging amounts of money, high amounts of money, on and on, over and over again, expecting the same increment in terms of profitability in our supply chain. There is going to be a certain point after which it is very, very reasonable and mathematically provable that the amount of money you're investing in technology is not yielding the same amount of money in terms of data dividend. It is quite similar to the aspect of the law of diminishing returns as we have seen in basic macroeconomics as well. And the second thing is the bullwhip effect factor itself, how it comes into the picture in a data driven system, as I will be showing it using the illustrations as well. And third, the more I would say fun part of the research paper analysis was the focus on the Indian context. Now we are living in a very globalized world. I mean, this COVID pandemic is probably doing a better job of showing this to us right now than anything else has been the case in history before. That one country getting disrupted in a globalized transitive economy, in a globalized transitive supply chain, is going to have a domino effect on economies and supply chains throughout the world. Now, in the case of a pandemic, obviously it's not just one country, it's multiple countries which are getting affected by large, and we can see the results of things. I mean, of course, the lockdown is extremely important for the preservation of human life, but it has an undeniable impact on our economy as well, which we can clearly see, and it cannot be understood in a better way than the supply chain outlook in the given situation. And I will be, sort of mixing some observations which I've come across in the news as well, for the sake of the presentation, to give a better spice and to give a better perspective as to how this is affecting us more closer to a home than we have actually anticipated it to be. Now, that's a very, very fun and interesting observation that I came across. So moving on, uh, this is again a very, very alarming statistic that we can possibly fathom as a supply chain enthusiast, that there is an opportunity ROI boost, an opportunity potential growth of at least 30% if the bullwhip effect is analyzed properly and the industries are geared accordingly. And 30% is not a small number by any means. In fact, if a supply chain manager is able to produce an impact of even at least 5 to 6%, and that too I'm exaggerating to be honest, as we have seen across in the case studies, it would be considered a miracle. A 30%, let alone, is a huge number that I cannot even possibly represent or fathom. So the right fit criteria, what do we need to brainstorm in order to determine the qualitative side and the qualitative impact of the bullwhip effect analysis? The first thing is, obviously, as we have seen through the extensive use of forecasting and supply chain, it is an industry which is completely run by data, right from the suppliers all the way back to the consumers, and even the wholesale dealers, the middlemen. It is completely driven by trends, by qualitative projections, and it is something that is moving towards a very, very data driven model, as we can see clearly. Second thing is scalability. The scalability is very, very important to tap into when you're traveling across multiple markets in the world. It is quite possible that the volume that you're dealing with in a market, let's say in China or India, is significantly higher than that of, let's say, uh, the state of Texas in the United States of America. But there are certain trends, certain consumer projections, certain consumers' scalability as far as their user choice, their requirements as a consumer is concerned, that is going to be more or less fluid. That's going to be in more or less the same ballpark. And it is very, very important to create a model, especially for a multinational company, which is not only context specific, but it is also flexible and agile in terms of scalability. The third thing is, obviously, the accuracy of the trend projections, which lead to the eventual running of the supply chain. It has to be very, very accurate, and the risk exposure that goes into trend projection becomes significantly higher. So, the margin of error that a supply chain analyst would be permitted when they are going for trend projection in a largely data driven system reduces even more significantly. And this ultimately leads us to a more seamless supply chain, which is again the bottom line objective of any system, any supply chain system that we run throughout. Now, this is, of course, the bullwhip effect, and as the name itself suggests, and as we have discussed quite extensively in class, it is um, the variation of projections and the variations in demands as it goes all the way from the consumer to the supplier in an upstream basis. And of course, the impacts of the bullwhip effect are different depending on the industry and the product itself. But this is the fundamental theory, as was discussed by Forrester, if I believe correctly, if I remember correctly, in back in 1963. So this was definitely one of those hallmark times where supply chain industries looked at something which they have underlooked for a very very long time, which had a lot of potential in terms of generating profitability and in terms of generating time boundness in the systems, as well as you will be seeing further ahead in the presentation. So, before we jump into the Indian context and the parameters on the basis of which we determine uh, the right fit between cost effectiveness and technology effectiveness, it is quite important to look at the psychological problem that the bullwhip effect poses us as a consumer as well as a supply chain manager alike. As you can see that back in 1961, I believe I gave you the wrong year in terms of 1963, 1961, my bad. As J. Forrester as came up with this particular theory, we realized that the bullwhip effect came into practice after a much, much longer period of time. And ultimately, in the early 90s to the mid 90s, back when Procter and Gamble got adequate data and evidence to back this theory, saying that the bullwhip effect, boss, it actually plays out in our markets, and this is something that we can see in very very consumer driven industries, the FMCG industries, and their product in their particular case was Pampers, which was a very very seasonal as well as a very very consumer driven product, a consumer driven entity, which not only has to be competitive in terms of technology, it has to be quality conscious and it has to be cost effective to be appeasable, to be sellable as a commodity to the huge segment it was targeting. Right, it's families all across the world. That's the volume of market that we're talking about. So we can clearly see that there was a huge gap uh, in terms of bringing the bullwhip effect from theory into practice, and it had to take a giant like Procter and Gamble to actually do so. Now, this shows us two things which any researcher cannot probably prove, but this is an unwritten testament to the psychology that we as supply chain managers as well as students as alike, when you're asking it out in class, face. First, you are not likely to invest in something unless it is backed with data. As simple as that. You will not jump into something, especially when the risk exposure attached to it is bound to be significantly high in an industry, unless you have adequate data to prove it. And that is exactly what Procter and Gamble did. They got the adequate data, they got the evidence, and even though they had an opportunity cost which they lost over the years, until they were dead sure about the bullwhip effect playing into picture in the case of their commodities, they did not jump into the bandwagon, but let alone create this trend in the industry. And the second thing is, this evidence is going to be, again, as I've discussed in the very beginning, is going to be very very context driven. So naturally this evidence is going to be much more easily producible, let's say in an FMCG industry, than maybe in an automobile industry, which is not as fast moving or not as agile or not as responsive to the markets comparatively to the FMCG industries in nature, because of its significantly higher inventory throughput, as well as it's significantly higher lead times, right? Um, so there is an aspect of time which is unwritten, but which is equally and critically involved in this aspect. And of course, when we're talking about eventually the Indian market as well, of course, an Indian citizen is very, very driven with the cost effectiveness of the product. Now, there are so many Boston Consulting Group research reports out there which prove that, the average Indian is probably more likely to compromise in the quality of a product than the cost itself. That's the funnily called Indian middle class mentality, and the mileage mentality, that we are all driven with. When a person selling a Lamborghini, a salesman selling a Lamborghini, is probably more likely to get a question on mileage, कि कितना देती है, more than the actual life of the product itself. So when you are talking about such a mentality which is imbibed in the market itself, you're looking at a market which is very very price sensitive. So the tolerance to price fluctuation is going to be significantly lower as well. And that is very clearly visible in the bullwhip effect playing out in the Volvo electric car productions. So naturally, because of the initial price ceiling, which was considered to be more than what the average Indian consumer could have paid for, so it was only targeting a very, very niche market. The Volvo production was going on at a very, very small but a very focused market segment. But as soon as the tax cuts, as well as the general economic relaxations that were provided by the Indian government to promote the production of electric cars, as well as promote the rechargeability of electric cars by setting up a lot of power stations and setting up that infrastructure, it made things easier for most of these electric car manufacturers. And Volvo was not any stranger to that as well. Because of the price cuts, there was a natural spike in the demand because of the eco-friendly tag associated with it as well. And once they ramped up production, since they did not anticipate the change in the automobile industry over the last period of 2 quarters, there was an excess inventory, which of course goes on to show that it was not necessarily the best of ideas to ramp up inventory and to ramp up production at the rate which they initially did. And the bullwhip effect can be probably seen in multitudes of ways, but it can be broken down into five key, very, very key, easy verticals when it comes from a data perspective. The very first thing is demand forecasting as itself. The second one is batch ordering. The third one is lead times. And the fourth one is supply shortages. And the fifth one is price fluctuations, as I've already discussed. Now, of course, the bullwhip effect can manifest itself, as I've discussed in the research paper as well, in two ways, in either of two ways. It can be an example of a bullwhip excess, or it can be an example of a bullwhip shortage. So, an example of the bullwhip excess is the Volvo electric car case, as I've discussed, and the bullwhip shortage would probably be something that we're facing right now. Right, because of the consumer hoarding. I mean, you're getting one shot to buy inventory once in 2 weeks. So the original goods manufacturers did not anticipate the COVID crisis coming into the picture, and naturally we are facing a shortage of goods because of the spike in consumption. So of course, both of these cases are not ideal for a supply chain manager. Always want an equilibrium where there is the right fit between supply and demand, as we have discussed in class extensively again. And in the research paper, again, we can clearly see that rigorous statistical analysis suggests that even though it is probably not possible to achieve 100% efficient system, you must strive to do so, and you must create a structured mechanism to reduce the margins of error on successive iterations. Right. So again, primarily when we're talking about a consumer-based model, so that is a business to consumer model. So the room for iterations and the room for error are by default significantly lesser compared to that of a business to business counterpart. Now, because of this fundamental nature of the business model itself and the dynamic nature of the market, there's two things that we have to consider before we take the final decision of implementing such technology. The very first supply chain challenge is the forecast needs to be scalable. The second thing is, how do you tap into and reap the large market opportunity cost? And third, how do you drive your systems to the extent that they become self-learning in nature and they become automated on a data-driven basis? That is the end game. That is the end goal that we're trying to achieve as pioneers of supply chain here. The cost challenges, on the other hand, is of course that the initial investment is extremely high. Second, the data and technology gap. Now, this is a very interesting one. You know, as Indians, there is a very funny and famous saying in Hindi: "फटाफट result चाहिए." Right? We need results immediately. We do not want to wait. We are a very impatient crowd, and because of the virtue of impatience, we want to immediately see and measure the results of the technology that we're investing. Unfortunately, the very nature of the technology dictates that these these effects of investment, these returns on investment become much more glaring and obvious and much more significant after we have got adequate data to make sure that the system is accurate and it does not face anomalies on a regular basis. So when you're talking about a system which grows over a period of time, you do not really want to invest blindly, especially when it is such a heavy investment, when you know that the real profitability is going to come into the picture probably 8 years down the line or 9 years down the line after the point of establishing that technology, let alone investing it. So that is a big challenge that we're facing, but again, it's a very debatable thing. And the third thing is certain systems are not inherently designed to be very data driven and effectively um, run and relearn by data. It's very similar to something that we learn in Six Sigma as well when we talk about quality consciousness. It's called the DFSS approach, design for Six Sigma approach. Now, what that means is when a system is not inherently geared towards inculcating the aspects of quality consciousness, you do not really have anything that you can possibly do other than creating a separate system by initially throwing that existing system out of the window and creating a system from scratch. And again, goes without saying, this is an extremely heavy investment. And of course, the context of the industry. Now, you can only talk about these challenges when you're talking about, let's say, the touch point being extremely small. When you're talking about the FMCG industry and the potential opportunity cost being extremely high, where you can justify investing so much because you can generate profitability which is dwarfing the initial investment. But this is not the case with each and every investment which uses supply chain on a very regular basis. A very good example of this to understand the mentality and the psychological part of the problem, apart from the technological part of the problem here, would be taking a look at the Chinese lean industry. Now, you might think that the Chinese are very quality conscious people, but they're not. I mean, you can make fun of the Chinese people and the Chinese industries as much as you want, but it is an undeniable and undisputed fact that they are the best as far as the supply chain business is concerned in the world, let alone in South Asia. So, if you want to create something which is quality conscious in the Chinese market, it is impossible. It is absolutely impossible. What they deal with there is tolerance levels which are dealing with a very high volume. What that means is their philosophy is very simple. They're saying instead of making 10 items with 90% accuracy, that means 9 out of 10 items will be perfect and there will be one defect. They will create a system which is capable of producing 100 items with probably an 80% accuracy. So they're negating the aspect of quality consciousness with a very lean, very fast system which is producing probably 10x to 15x, and I am probably even under estimating their businesses. I have seen, as virtue of working on some projects with them, there are some cases because of government support as well as the inherent nature of the technology that they're using, they are probably 100x in terms of volume that the Indian manufacturing sector has even seen right now. That is the difference in terms of scale that we're talking about. So things like data does not make sense to them at all. When you talk about reducing the aspect of consumer based sensitivity driven through data, they would ask me to shut up and go somewhere else, because they would just say, "Ki boss, we'll make that much. We do not really want to be conscious. It's not really a wastage for us. Not creating that would be a bigger waste for us because of the largely lean nature of that industry." So a very rigorous data driven system would not be a right fit for such a industry, right? So this is where we see that this is the challenge that we're facing. One side, these are the supply chain challenges that we can tackle. On the other side, you have these cost challenges as well. And the technologies that we're targeting are the lean systems, the agile systems. Agile systems is basically a system which is scalable and very fast to adapt to any change in the market. Artificial intelligence goes without saying, and reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is essentially a smart, self-driven system which is capable of growing and expanding on its own. Now, these are the three tenets when we want to strike the perfect balance, we must use behavioral data. The winning iteration can be significantly reduced using softwares, and the segment that the market is targeting has to be broken down into smaller subsets in order to make sure that our machine learning models are going to be as accurate as possible. So this is the fundamental volume driven market change that we're looking at. Now, having established what the bullwhip effect is and the cost versus technology aspect to this, let us have a look at the Indian context, because that is, at the end of the day, one of the prime focuses of the research paper that I've analyzed here. So the fundamental mission statement here is that we have to build a seamless understanding between the operators and the consumer and the drivers alike in order to make our supply chain as agile and reactive as possible. And of course, our parameter for determining where a system is agile or reactive is going to be the constraint of time itself. How much time bound and time conscious is our system when it comes to a heavy investment? And for the sake of the research paper, we also went into a case study of the fresh food vegetable market. And it shows that there is a huge information gap between the consumers and the raw material providers and the wholesale players, which creating a lapse in the supply chain and the forecast trends for the subsequent iteration of the supply chain as well. So in effect, the bullwhip effect is compounding over multiple iterations, which is a very difficult thing to tackle from a qualitative standpoint without the utilization of data. The second thing is the inherent loopholes to come back in a supply chain. So ideally, we assume that there is a one-way path as far as the product is concerned, all the way from the raw material supplier to the consumer. We do not consider the impact or the distortion that is created because of the bullwhip effect when a consumer is given a re-entry point in the supply chain. So a free return or an exchange policy in multiple commodities, let's say in vegetables as far as quality consciousness is concerned, or even the clothing industry in India, that has created a lot of anomalies in trends which make the effect even worse. So how do we tackle this? That is the next question. So we realize that in a very fast moving touch point industry where freshness and quality are a minimum benchmark, we have to go for the heavy investment of data driven systems, because that is the only way right now available to us which can enable us to make our supply chains more agile and responsive, and obviously in the longer run more accurate as far as projections are even concerned in the way ahead. So there is apart from now in the Indian context. Now, as I've already mentioned in the beginning, because of the price sensitive nature of the market, we are more likely to compromise on quality than on price. The pricing in a supply chain can only be tamed by taming time. It is as simple as that. Now, be it from the concept of the freshness of a product or a bakery item which is manufactured at 6 p.m. and then produced at 11 a.m. in the bakery, or a sweet which is produced, or maybe a clothing item which is produced, or maybe vegetables, as we have already again discussed in the previous slide. We are looking at a very aggressive but a very fast data responsive system which has taken into account consumer satisfaction and time as a commodity which is having a direct impact on money itself. Studies, including the research paper itself, suggests that we're losing somewhere in the ballpark of around 29% opportunity cost. The best part here is that this is very close to the estimate that McKinsey has provided for supply chains all over the world, and that is the maximum benchmark. So it shows that we are very close to the maximum benchmark as far as the maximum estimate is possible. So the growth potential and the huge the supply chain potential that is untapped here is virtually maximum. It is as much as we can possibly even think of, which is exactly why such a heavy investment is needed right now, because it is inevitable to give us 10x to even 12x more returns over a period of time in the future, and it is going to keep on increasing this ROI is virtually limitless. It's just the tip of the iceberg, to be honest. So again, moving on with the margins that we talked about, the margins have to be minimized as and when we progress with the supply chain in the future once such a system has been established. And again, the debatable approach that we've talked about, the relevance of such a system, depending on the nature of the product and the nature of the market itself, like the China versus India example we have discussed in the research paper as well. So the bottom line here is that it is an opportunity cost, no doubt, but we have to be very, very wise in analyzing where this opportunity cost can be profitably tapped and where this opportunity cost is just a misnomer and in reality is just a lure for us to lose money. So I would like to conclude my presentation by saying that upon the rigorous analysis of the multiple research papers that I've done and the presentation that I got an opportunity to present because of this course, I realized that the common notion that just because there is potential that exists in a certain sector, it does not mean that it is going to pan out as a profitable potential in every possible system. It is very, very important to understand the context variables and the nature of the consumers in the market before taking the bite in such a system in the first place. Thank you so much for your time, sir. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you're doing extremely well right now. Stay home and stay safe, sir. Thank you so much.